Hello, Socrates at Saddlebrooke. Welcome back to our current series on the origin of the species. How in the world did all this incredible, wondrous variety of life get here? In part one, I reviewed 4 different worldviews people have in explaining the origin of life. Was it created by God? Was it created by evolution from a common ancestor? Some combination of the two approaches put together? Or even a new approach, something like intelligent design? Now, in this part 2, I will show how Darwinian evolution explains the origin of the species. But I'll be giving it a critical examination of the current scientific evidence. Is all this wondrous nature a creation of nature alone, as evolution says? Or is it a creation of God, as most people believed before Darwin and still believe today? As you'll recall, the lecture series started out with my employer's okay, since I was giving this series on my own time. And it was after hours and apart from my day job, but it's gotten a little testy, as you know from my previous podcasts, when I started critically analyzing evolution and suggesting that there are other scientific theories that should be considered. When I mentioned the word intelligent design, I was asked to disassociate the series from my work altogether. They say that intelligent design is a pseudoscience, and I was attempting to introduce religion into science. Now, I disagreed and showed them that I was talking about pure science, but that didn't seem to help. Now, I haven't heard anything definitive yet, but I'm concerned about what's going to happen as a result of this current presentation. I might not be wearing this lab coat much longer, because today I'll be critically evaluating Darwin's theory in light of the most recent scientific discoveries. As you probably know, Darwinian evolution has been the dominant theory of biological organisms for the past 160 years. It's what we teach our kids. It's taught in public school all the way from the lower grades all the way through the PhD programs. And over the years, it has become the foundational worldview for many other scientific and cultural academic disciplines as well. So the stakes are high. In fact, evolution has become the basis for much of our public policy today and our political correctness as well. So, and should I dare say this, much of our government funding as well. Hence, I've been, quote, encouraged not to critique Darwin in light of this disconfirming evidence, but today I'll be sharing what the research actually shows. And I'll be inviting you to evaluate this evidence and decide for yourself just what direction you think the evidence points. I can only hope that my employer will see that I'm trying to be factual, scientific, and open-minded. I'll be inviting each of you to evaluate this evidence and decide for yourself in what direction you think it points. I can only hope that my employer will see it that way, that I'm being factual and open-minded. But I realize that I'm bucking the establishment view, and I'm afraid that these lectures will be considered dangerous and my position at the Institute will be in jeopardy. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Now, join me now at the beautiful Mountain View Country Club in Saddlebrooke, Arizona for my forum lecture on Darwinian evolution. I'll be back. This is a topic that you don't normally discuss, right? Evolution, creation, theistic evolution are types of things that you discuss with your own friends and everything, but you usually don't have cross-fertilization, and that's really what we're aiming for today. Last presentation, I introduced the 4 different worldviews, which are kind of the quadrants of understanding, and I think everybody identifies primarily or majority-wise with one of these worldviews. Either you're a creationist or you're an evolutionist, or you're try to combine the two. What we're going to do today is really take a critical view of the theory of evolution. And I called it a theory in crisis. You'll see why. And this is going to be a deep dive. I'm really going to take 3 different topics and parallel them at the same time. So take a breath. I'm going to have a breathing exercise like this after each little section. We're going to stop, take a time out, and then take a deep dive again. And the reason I'm doing that is because evolution is a topic that isn't just one topic. Evolution, even from the scientific standpoint, is 3 different topics at the same time. And one gets confused if they just take a deep dive in one of the areas and not look at the overall picture. So this is going to be a little bit of a challenge to get all this stuff done in 40 minutes. What's in the box there, in the white box, I'm really going to focus on creation as one view, evolution as another. These are diametrically opposed. And I'm going to define them as diametrically opposed. I'm going to define theistic evolution as the attempt to bring the two together, but they're like poles of a magnet. When they get pretty close, they start repelling each other pretty hard. Here we go. And the reason is because here's 3 definitions of evolution, and we're going to look in each one of these areas. Does it mean change over time? Does it mean common ancestry? Or does it mean the mechanism of evolution, which is random mutation and natural selection? I'm going to go into each one of these deeply but quickly. And I'm going to start back in 1966. I can see from the age of the group here that we probably remember this time, 1966. We might even remember this particular Time magazine article, Is God Dead? And the reason Is God Dead was on the cover of Time magazine is because at that time, Darwinian evolution was considered a fact. The verdict was in. And it was put this way by one of the architects of the Darwinian evolution theory, George Gaylord Simpson, that man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. And the reason I'm putting that quote up there in juxtaposition to where we're going with Socrates is we are looking at big questions. And the big question we're examining in this particular series has science rediscovered God. So that's kind of diametrically opposed to the Time magazine article. And we're saying unexpected scientific evidence of the last 50 years. Unexpected scientific evidence of the last 50 years reveals origin and destiny. So let's look at these 2 things in parallel. What is the evidence and what is the unexpected evidence? The day that this was announced, or the year that this was announced, that in Chicago, University of Chicago, the brightest and the best of the evolutionary biologists at the time, and this panel was chaired by Julian Huxley, which is a public intellectual, said the following, and I'm going to read this in detail, because this will get the impact of what was declared that day. All aspects of reality are subject to a single process of evolution. In 1859, Darwin opened the passage to a new pattern of thought and belief. There is no longer need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, mind and soul, as well as brain and body. So did religion. Evolutionary man can no longer take refuge in the arms of a divinized Father whom he created himself. The triumph of Darwinian evolution. Well, is that statement true? I mean, what does the scientific evidence say? Is it a true statement? And I'm talking about the scientific facts. I'm not talking about just the philosophical presuppositions that creation and evolution are based on. That materialistic philosophy was well articulated by Carl Sagan. You might remember, the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. Everything is material. There is no other dimension to anything. There is no supernatural dimension. There's nothing beyond nature. Everything has to be explained by material. On the theistic side, it's the same thing. God is real. The theist believes that God is real. He's not the imaginary God or the divinized Father that we make up with a mind that evolved. God is real, and he created all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. These are diametrically opposed materialistic philosophies. And both are faith statements. This is important. Both are statements of faith. Neither one of them is a scientific statement. Can't be proved, can't be put in a laboratory, can't be put in a bottle, can't be reproduced. It's a philosophical conclusion, but it's not based on blind faith. It's based on evidence. We collect evidence, we look at the evidence, and then we interpret the evidence from our worldview. And does it point that direction? Does it point this direction over here? And then when we absorb that, we say, that's it, that's what I believe, that's my judgment, and that's my worldview. Once we establish a worldview, it's pretty difficult to change a worldview. Pretty difficult. I mean, it doesn't matter all the evidence, and that's what the debates are about, the evidence and so forth, but you kind of get in your worldview. But in your worldview, you have to take a step of faith to believe the final judgment that you make. Not blind faith, but a step of faith. So just briefly, we know the tenets of creation. God created, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but I do want, in part 5, when I get there, I do want to go into what I call the scientific evidence of creation. If we're going to put Darwin in the dock and look at the scientific evidence for evolution, we got to do the same with creation. Can you do that? Can you do that with a religious proposition? But we'll wait to part 5 on that one. But just briefly, I mean, God is real. This is what the theist believes. God is the creator of all things, including us. God is supernatural, all-powerful being who is personal. He's personal, he interacts. He just didn't wind up the universe and let it go. That's the deist position. That's not the theist position. The theist position is that God is real, interacts with his creation. In fact, superintends it. The biblical account of creation makes scientific truth claims. The Bible is not a scientific document, but it makes truth claims. It claims to be true statements about reality, that God created the heavens and the earth. Can that be empirically tested? That's a fascinating question. The theist says absolutely it can be scientifically tested. And we'll talk about that. Creation, God did it, is diametrically opposed to Darwinian evolution, that nature did it. Okay, deep dive. 3 tenets of Darwinian evolution can mean change over time, can mean common ancestry, can mean random mutation and natural selection. It actually means all 3 of those. So let's look at all 3 of them. The first meaning of Darwinian evolution is change over time. So let's look at explanations of what change over time could mean. Could mean just the history of life, could mean adaptation of creatures to their environment, and it can mean natural selection. We must be clear about what definition we're talking about. Where's the evidence come from? The evidence comes from the fossil record. We've talked about this at the bottom of the geological column there as Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. 3.8 billion years ago, we start seeing creatures, living cells. Then we wait for a long period of time. We come into 542 million years ago, the Cambrian Explosion it's called. And then each of these layers of deposits, like you go to the Grand Canyon, you'll see layers and layers and layers, and you'll find out in each one of those layers you have different creatures. Well, different creatures mean those creatures existed at different periods of time. So the time scale goes up, and the complexity of what we find in those layers goes up. Complexity goes all the way from primordial ooze to the living cell, to fish, to amphibian, to reptiles, to mammals, to man. Change over time. Does it just mean history of life? There's no discussion about that. There's no dispute. It means history of life. If we mean that we went from primordial ooze in the bottom layers all the way up to mankind, and there's a history of life, no dispute. But if it means that those arrows mean that there's a scientific process that takes place that changes one to the other, to the other, to the other, to the other, then there's a major dispute. Do we mean adaptation? What do I mean by adaptation? Well, you take a sheep in the Sahara Desert that has short hair. it needs to have short hair. If you take a sheep that's raised in the Arctic Circle, needs to keep warm, and it changes. It adapts to the environment. We know that creatures adapt to their environment. We know we adapt to our environment. We know plants adapt to the environment. There's no dispute about that at all. But do we mean that sheep turn into man and women over time? Then there's a major dispute. Do we mean selection? What do I mean by selection? Artificial selection. Darwin was a pigeon breeder. He bred all kinds of pigeons. We know that that can be done. We know that we breed dogs. We have little chihuahuas, and we have Great Danes, and we have all sizes in between. They're all dogs. No dispute about artificial selection, but it's within certain limits, right? It's not that broad. If we mean that within artificial selection can be used as evidence for natural selection, where nature does the same thing as an intelligent breeder does, then we have a major dispute. So let's look at the evidence for each one of these. Darwin's theory predicts continuous accumulation of small changes. Darwin said nature does not make jumps. What he was out to show was that special creation is not a scientific statement. He was there to show that continuous accumulation of small changes, nature does what before we suppose God did. So if we take the green timeline there and we go all the way back to the beginning, Darwin told us that we're going to have a continuous accumulation of changes all the way from goo to you. But what nature has shown is it's a series of huge jumps. First life just jumps into existence as if it had no evolutionary history. Cambrian Explosion is the second one. Most of the major body plans came into existence all at one time. We've even timed it at 540 million years ago. Dinosaurs, boom, come into existence. Plants, called the Big Bloom, boom, come into existence. Almost everything comes into existence in a series of jumps, not in a series of continuous accumulated changes. What's the scientific evidence for adaptation? Well, this is pictures I took at the Science Museum, Natural Museum of Science in San Francisco. You see these at the Smithsonian Institute. No matter where you go, you'll see Darwin's finches as an example of adaptation and how evolution works. The sign reads, and I won't go through the whole sign here, but I'll say that here we see evolution at work. Today, they continue to evolve. I'm talking about Darwin's finches right before our eyes. And over time, these small changes in the finch, the finch beak adds up to a new species. Now, what are they talking about? Galapagos Islands, Darwin viewed the finches. Some have long beaks, some have short stubby beaks. When two scientists were there in the 70s, they noticed that, and they happened to have a drought, that the ones with the long beaks were diminishing. Well, they couldn't get at, because of the drought, they couldn't get at the bugs. But the ones with the short, heavy beaks could dig into the trees and dig into the ground, and population started to increase. So over time, that species started changing, but did it change into another species? That's the questionable part of it. The National Academy of Sciences, which is our most august scientific organization, in 1999 wrote a pamphlet explaining Darwin's finches. And here's some quotes from it. A particularly compelling example of the origin of the species. If droughts occurred about once every 10 years, a new species of finches will rise in only 200 years. So now they're making a projection just based on the millimeter change in this variation in population size between the long beak, or the short beak and the long beak. The National Association of Science commentary admits a very inconvenient fact there, that once the rains returned, there were no lasting changes, no new species. This is a cyclical variation based on adaptation. And there's interbreeding, too, that has to be accounted for. Darwin critic Philip Johnson, Berkeley law professor, wrote this to the Wall Street Journal after the National Academy of Sciences reported this, and he said, when our leading scientists have to resort to the sort of distortion that would land a stock promoter in jail, you know they are in trouble. Selection is the third definition of change over time. Artificial versus natural. Well, Darwin's theory, animal and plant breeders use artificial selection. That gives evidence that nature can do the same thing without direction and without limit. But the scientific evidence is that artificial selection can be done only by intelligent beings, and what takes place is all within a species and within strict limits. What do I mean by that? Well, dogs don't become something else. Dogs can get bigger, smaller, they can have different characteristics. Stallions can be bred to run faster and so forth, but they stay stallions. Sugar beets can be increased in production, and the amount of sugar that they produce from 12% to 21%, but you can't push it beyond 21%. There's natural limits to these things. So nature does not do what artificial does, plus we have strict examples of limits on how far it can go. So what has been demonstrated scientifically? History of life? Life becomes increasingly complex, yes, but it becomes complex. What we see are there's jumps in the complexity over time, and with huge gaps of time in between, and with little evidence for Darwinian process in between. Adaptation, yes. Minor adaptations take place within species to changing environments and cyclical variations, but no new species. We call that, in evolutionary scientists call this microevolution. We know that microevolution occurs within limits. Selection, artificial only, accomplished by intelligent intervention with the kind. We have not created new species in a laboratory. We can't do it even with our own brains, let alone let nature do it on its own. Again, what has been accomplished is microevolution, not what evolutionary biologists call macroevolution. What has not been demonstrated? History of life, no intermediate fossils demonstrating that evolution is in action. There are only assumptions that macroevolution occurred. Darwin assumed we would find the fossil remains of, say, intermediate creatures. So if you have one creature evolving into another creature, that we'd see something in between. Fossil record, we've been looking for 160 years for that. Nothing. Adaptation, minor adaptation, which is microevolution, occurs, but it does not serve as demonstration for macroevolution. There's a lot of theory that says, see the beak variations and the species variations within the species on the galactic. I can extrapolate this now to 200 years from now, we'll have a whole new thing, a set of creatures. That doesn't happen. Natural selection, even with intelligent intervention, one creature does not turn into another, let alone letting nature do it in a random style. So, Socrates, I'm going to take a Socrates moment here. Microevolution has been demonstrated, but macroevolution has not yet been demonstrated. Only an assumption, not a fact, only an assumption. So proof for microevolution is not proof of macroevolution. The second meaning of Darwinian evolution, common ancestry. This is probably the biggest assumption that evolutionists make, common ancestry. How did that come about, and what does it mean? Well, it means universal common ancestry according to Darwin. He called it descent with modification. What does that mean? Well, we have a creature that descends in evolution over time, gets modified to the next creature, basically. All creatures that ever lived have descended from one or few evolutionary primordial life forms. Darwin did acknowledge an original creation, by the way. That's interesting, but that's as far as it went. So according to Darwin, the primary creation was done, and then everything after that became evolution. Over long periods of time, which is what he called descent,
These gradually evolved with modification into more complex items or complex forms. Therefore, all living organisms are genetically related. So we can trace our ancestry. You hear we came from chimps, right? We go from chimps, and chimps came from this, and so forth, all the way back to the first living cell. Therefore, all living organisms are genetically related. And this relationship can be represented by a tree of life. So if you go to any museum or open up any evolutionary textbook or whatever, you'll see the Darwinian tree of life. This is in the lower right-hand corner is how Darwin drew it in The Origin of Species. It's the only figure in his book. We get a little better artistic work over years of time and so forth, and we represent it like that. So on the left branch, we have the bacteria, and they evolve in their own way. Then we have the grasses, and in the middle there to the right, and then we have all the crustaceans and the amphibians. Finally, we get to the right-hand side there. We go from snakes to lizards to crocodiles to whales, all the way up to humans. So all of life can be represented by this evolutionary tree, is how the theory goes. Universal common ancestry. And this is interesting because this is accepted by not only evolutionists, but theistic evolutionists too, who try to put these together. Francis Collins, who you may know, is just retired as our director of National Institute of Health. And before that, he headed up the Human Genome Project, where we actually decoded the human genetic, the human genome. And he's also a confessed Christian, so he is a theistic evolutionist. He says virtually all geneticists are convinced that we share a common ancestor. That's quite a statement. Virtually all geneticists are convinced that we share common ancestors. Well, this is true. Here's the 4 lines of evidence that are given. The major 4 lines of evidence. The fossil record, homology. What does homology mean? All right, homology just means structural similarities. I have an arm, I have an elbow, I have this, and it does certain things. Well, so does a bird. A bird has a wing, but he has a very similar structure. So does a porpoise for actually swimming. He can swim. So that's homology. Those structural similarities, according to Darwin, are good evidence for common ancestry. Genetics is the big one. Back when Darwin gave his theory, he had no understanding of genetics at all. But in the early 20th century, we had an explosion of understanding the human genome. And we talked about that in our previous sessions and so forth. Understanding how DNA makes proteins, makes body structures, body forms, and so forth. We understand a lot about genetics. When that science of genetics was combined with Darwin's theory of evolution in the early 20th century, they called it the neo-Darwinian synthesis. That's the formal terminology if you were to study this in school. Neo-Darwinian synthesis, which is taking Darwinian evolution and genetics and putting them together. So this genetic evidence is the primary, allegedly the primary evidence for common ancestry. And then embryology is a big one. Darwin thought that was the single most important line of evidence for his theory. Let's look at each one of them. Fossil record. Fossil record should contain evidence of forms of life that are intermediate transitional stages. Darwin said the fossils will be found to demonstrate his theory. Well, the evidence isn't there. 160 years, we've collected so much evidence that you can make pretty strong probabilistic explanations that we're not going to find anything more in between. We find sudden appearances, explosions of fully formed creatures with no intermediates. In fact, so much so that in the late 20th century, Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the leaders in Darwinian theory, said, "We're not going to find them, guys. Forget it. They're not going to even find this." He came up with punctuated equilibrium. He said, "I don't exactly know why we're not going to find it, but maybe it happens overnight. Maybe there's just a jump." Dick was telling me about an egg they opened up from a dinosaur inside a chicken egg. We're not going to find the evidence, but we know evolution took place. So we're not going to find these intermediates. Homology, similarities. Just because there's similarities in structures doesn't mean necessarily that it can be explained by a tree of life better than a creation. I mean, if you have a creation, a creator could use similar structures to make an arm and a leg and a bat wing and a porpoise fin and so forth. Darwin said, quote, "I view all beings as not special creations, but as lineal descents of very few beings." Well, he had a philosophical presupposition that we were going to find his theory. Genetics. This is the big one. We thought for sure that genetics would prove evolution. Why? Well, because DNA, which is the code of life, which makes the proteins, which makes the structures, and so forth, if we trace the genes, tree of life on the gene, that should kind of line right up with what the forms are. So we have a group of people drawing the forms, trees with the forms going from one species or one creature to another creature. Then we have a group doing the gene pool and doing the same thing with the gene pool. Those should coincide somehow. But what we find is they're total contradiction. So much so that we spend a lot of time figuring out, well, is that 50% similar or 60% similar or 10% similar or whatever. You can spend that kind of time the rest of your life, but the conclusion is that from a lot of the most prominent now evolutionary biologists is the tree of life cannot properly be represented as a tree. Embryology. Darwin considered this and he said, quote, "Embryology to me is by far the single strongest class of facts in favor of my theory." So what is the theory? Human embryos and all vertebrate embryos are similar, which gives evidence that we share a common ancestor. Is that true? I just love that statement there. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You want to just... right, Brenda, would you like to say that one at a party, right? Wouldn't you like that one? Oh, you have it written down. Ontogeny. What in the world does that mean? Well, it means the growth of an organism during its embryonic stage. Remember, it starts off as a single cell and then becomes an embryo and then a fetal structure and then it's born as a baby and so forth. If you look at all the creatures and their embryology, it looks very similar. Looks very similar. I'll show it to you. Those are the pictures that appeared in in textbooks, right? For forever. Yeah, Brenda has one. They're good. The drawing on the left-hand side, you have a fish. There's the embryo. There's the fetus, and then eventually it is born into a fish. On the right-hand side, you have a human being. Very similar. In the middle, you have a chicken. And you can put all the other animals in there too. This came from a close friend of Darwin's, Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist who drew these comparisons up in the late 19th century. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have the Photoshop and so forth, but he drew these embryos. And unfortunately, well, before I even say what the unfortunate part of this is, look at the figure 815 at the bottom. I'm going to read this to you. 815. The early embryos of humans and other vertebrates look so similar that it takes an expert to tell them apart. During the early stages of development, all these embryos have gill pouches and a tail, remnants of all structures needed by our aquatic ancestors. So the assumption was that this is true. Gill pouches, what do you mean by that? Well, if you look at the embryo, if you can look at it, bend over the human embryo on the right-hand side there, you'll see kind of slits on the side here. That was assumed that was our fish stage of development. And what we found out is just wrinkles. I mean, it just creases. There's nothing associated with being in the fish stage. And the worst part is that Haeckel actually faked these drawings. In fact, this was known for 100 years that he faked them. And it appeared in biology textbook after biology textbook after biology. We're all trained in this in our high school biology, and those that go on to PhDs and so forth. This is part of the training. Here's the evolutionary biology textbook I have in my shelf there, 2009, Douglas Futuma, states, early in development, human embryos are almost indistinguishable from those of fishes and briefly display fish slits. Well, is that true? Fact is that embryos do not reenact their supposed earlier evolutionary stages during embryonic development. In fact, the Royal Society of London, which is like our National Academy of Sciences, they finally announced in 2003 that the embryonic data is, quote, counter to the predictions. But in evolutionary biology, it assumes the common ancestry is true despite of the evidence. And there's evolutionary apologists like P.C. Myers of the University of Minnesota who vehemently, he not only teaches this, but he still vehemently defends the ontology argument. So I put on my little critical thinking hat here. Me and Socrates have some good times occasionally, and I say to myself, why would these drawings be faked in the first place? Why weren't they discredited when the fake was first discovered? Why did it remain without footnote in research programs? Not just textbooks, research programs for over 100 years. Why is it in my biology textbook today? Summarizing, common ancestry, 4 lines of evidence. Fossil record, missing links are still missing. Life springs into full existence without evolutionary history. Homology, just because features and creatures look the same doesn't mean that they are the same. Genetics, the genetic trees and the structural trees do not agree. They don't line up. The hard data refutes the assumption. Embryology, embryological research shows that the data is, quote, counter to prediction. So Darwin's cumulative case falsifies, in my thinking anyway, falsifies his own view. There's 2. Take a deep breath. We're going to go into 3 now. Third meaning of Darwinian evolution. This is the mechanism, the alleged mechanism of how it works. This is what we in science love to do. We like to find mechanisms because that's cause and effect. That's real science. We can make predictions. We can say, because of this data, we can make a prediction that this will happen, and then we can kind of put it to the test. And when it does happen, we go, hallelujah. That's what scientists love to do. The mechanism is called random mutation and natural selection. Here's how Darwin put it. He said, the theory of natural selection, which the Origin, that's his book, Origin of the Species, so fully and so lucidly expounds, provides a mechanism by which such transformation could and would automatically be produced. Darwin called it random variation and natural selection as the mechanism of evolution. It's how evolution works, the mechanism that explains change over time and universal common ancestry. Well, what does this mean? Well, random DNA mutations. Let's take a look at this just briefly. Remember the DNA model we had? Mutations do take place randomly. A sequence, remember the ATCG chemicals that line up, or actually the genetic code that tells it how to build a protein. Occasionally you get a substitution. A C becomes a T. Or you get an insertion. You get a TAT rather than the C. Or you get a deletion. The CA goes out and a G is put in its place. What happens? A lot of times, most of the time, nothing. Or it dies. Random mutations are usually lethal. But if a mutation is a okay mutation, nothing really happens to the species. So here we go. Random mutations occur in nature and give a slight survival advantage to a population of living organisms. This is the theory we're probably most familiar with, called survival of the fittest. You hear that terminology all the time. You have a population that's doing well at a certain time in history, but now a random mutation takes place that's a good mutation, because we have deep time. We have millions of years we're talking about here. Millions of years we have talking about. So when a good mutation happens and provides the survival advantage for that population, when it does, the survival of the fittest, then that penetrates the whole population. And that population then goes on because it has a better survival advantage. It's been selected, has a better survival advantage. And over deep time, over millions of years, these survival advantages, these small advantages, accumulate to become a new species for that population. That's basically the mechanism. So natural selection part of it. So when the mutation happens, what happens on the natural selection part? Well, the natural selection part, Darwin saw his pigeon breeding in his artificial selection. He speculated that nature could do the same thing and eventually create a new species on its own. He says, quote, "I am fully convinced that species are not immutable." In other words, they don't change. Therefore, or they're not made special creation. He said, "Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the main, if not exclusive, means of modification. But the facts are that no one has ever bred a new species. There's no smoking gun. We go to a laboratory, where's the new species? Here we have intelligent people trying to mutate things into a new species. And if we can't do it with our brains, just because you have another 100 million years or so, how's nature going to do it? Especially if it's random and undirected. Nature. One thing about evolution is it has no goal in mind. It has no goal. When we do things, we have a goal in mind. And then we can take a controlled path. We go over here, no, we have to go here, no, we have to get to this goal. Nature doesn't know. Nature could, mutation could start off, well, let's say we wanted to go to New York. So we take off in that direction. We spin the dial and take off in that direction. Then we get beat up a little bit. No, it must be, let's spin the dial again. It's not like it's saying, no, you're going northeast, or northwest, you're not going east. There's no goal in mind here. No one has ever bred a new species, let alone has nature ever created a new species. Not even a new organ, not even a new body plan. Surely we can do this in a lab. This is the status of laboratory experimentation. Let's take what has been done in lab to demonstrate evolution. This is probably the best example of it. Professor Richard Lenski, E. coli evolution experiment. And in 30 years, he's bred now over 70,000 generations of random mutations. That's equivalent to over 2 million years of human history, human generations. Did we ever get anything other than E. coli out of it? No, we got a lot of microevolution. We got certain mutations that happened remember the little flagellum with the tail and so forth? Well, when the flagellum random mutation happened, the tail fell off some of these. Why? Because that bacteria has to save energy. So it gets rid of unused parts. We do the same thing if we were shipwrecked somewhere and had to get rid of the weight so we have some more time to live. We see that in this demonstration. So Professor Lenski's brilliant work, this is wonderful. He's demonstrated microevolution in action, but not macroevolution. It doesn't change into something else. And it also demonstrates something we weren't quite expecting. It demonstrates what the limits of evolution, what the limits are. He found out that it works not by creating new functions, which is what the evolutionary theory says, something that's helping the next generation. It actually works by breaking things. It breaks it, throws off its tail, for example, to survive. It needs to do that. How about mutation experimentation? This is one of the best ones. Since the 70s, we've been bombarding these poor fruit flies with radiation to kind of mutate them and see what would happen. Well, did we ever breed a new species? The middle one, yeah, we put actually another pair of wings on a fly, but it's defective. Why is it defective? There's no muscles. You take that fly and you throw it out in the ring and it goes boom. It's effective. So what we get only 3 outcomes here. We don't get a new species. We don't even get a selected advantage. We get a normal fly which is a lot of times. We get a dead fly, and we get a defective fly. That's the end result. So let's summarize what we found out by our experimentation and what we know about random mutation and natural selection. Well, several lines of experimental evidence show that no new species are formed by random processes. We can argue a little bit about what a species means. Biologists don't even agree on what a species means. Is it that narrow, or is it that narrow, or something? What it isn't is this goes into this, and it goes into this. There are narrow limits to the changes that random processes can achieve. Darwinian evolution is a theory without a proven mechanism for the change required. And then for our theistic friends that believe that God's part of this process and God works through evolution, basically that's what theistic evolution believes, that God works through evolution. But adding the word theistic to evolution adds nothing to its explanatory power, and actually is antithetic to their original theistic special creation paradigm. So it's actually logically contradictory. Okay. I hate to go any farther, but we gotta go to the next stage, because I made a claim here with that got you here, and that was that this is a theory in crisis. So I gotta explain what I mean by that. In fact, I'll put it in the form of a question, because we're here to look at the body of evidence and decide which way it points for ourselves. I know I'm putting my own spin on it, but we all have our own spin on it, right? And you have an opportunity to agree, disagree. I promised last time I would never get mad. You can even make a speech, but limit it to 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Or you can make a proposal, and I'll accept. How much are we charging for renting the room again? We can have a special session for you. But I titled it that way because of Michael Denton's book. Michael Denton is an Australian molecular biologist and a medical doctor. And with his book, he really summarized the kind of things that I'm talking about here, and it rocked the intellectual world at the time, because it suggested that Darwinian evolution is a discredited theory. But today, 20 decades later, there's a legion of scientific evidence that supports his contention, and there's a desperate search for a new theory. Let's look at that. By the time we get to 2009, this is the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. Now we have the National Center of Biotechnology Information, Eugene Koonin, who's an expert in this field, and will make public statements. A lot of times these statements will be said in the family, but never on a public basis. But he actually makes a public statement here that traditional concept of the tree of life and the mechanism of evolution, that is natural selection, the main driving force of evolution, now indicate that the modern synthesis has crumbled, apparently beyond repair. 2021, we have some brilliant evolutionary biologists like James Shapiro at the University of Chicago coming up with something called natural genetic engineering. There's no end to our creativity to come up with new theories. I mean, that's what science is. You come up with a theory, you put it out on the table, you let people examine it, you collect evidence, and you make predictions, and you keep moving forward. James Shapiro says that there are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations. 2014, Shapiro and other groups around the world of evolutionary biologists are coming up with the third way, they call it. They're looking at the new era of genomics and epigenomics. And if you were to go to the third wave website, it would say Neo-Darwinism, which is clearly naturalistic science, but ignores much contemporary molecular evidence and invokes a set of unsupported assumptions about the accidental nature of hereditary variation. The buzz has even hit the Royal Academy in London, and finally in 2016, they called for a large-scale overhaul of the standard evolutionary theory. Encouraged, and this is how science works. I mean, when something doesn't work, we come up with new theories. We move on. That's the idea. I totally laud all these attempts here. Encourage attempts to develop new theories of evolution. They call it the extended evolutionary synthesis, EES. Now, one thing I want to make clear, though, that there's no design-based theories allowed here. No design-based theories. You've heard me talk about design and purpose as being scientifically viable. And we'll talk about that when we get to intelligent design. But they're not allowed. Why aren't they allowed? Why aren't they allowed? Shouldn't it be at least on the table and present its own evidence? All theories must be based on the philosophy of naturalism. What's the philosophy of naturalism? Material is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. That's unproven, unprovable. To a theist, there's the supernatural, too. Why can't it just be a theory on the table and we can accumulate evidence? Nobody's saying it's a creationist that Santa Claus did it, or Sugar Plum Fairy did it. That's a straw man that's put up sometimes. So my final thoughts on this are the scientific decline of Darwinism is, when will we correct what we know to be false? Are we going to acknowledge that Darwin did not prove his case? Are we going to correct the misinformation that's in every textbook, school curriculum, and research program today? Are we going to admit that naturalism is a philosophy and a bias? Are we going to be open to other approaches? Since Darwin did not prove his case against special creation, before Darwin, special creation was known to be assumed to be fact. And he set out to prove that it wasn't fact, that nature could do it. So since he didn't prove his case, is that back on the table? And if it's not back on the table, why not? As we consider new evolutionary models for the extended evolutionary synthesis, which is wonderful. I wish our own National Academy of Sciences would have something like the Royal Academy had and said, you know what, guys, we need a new synthesis here. We just can't keep on pounding the same thing. Will we allow design-based models on the table as well? They have to prove their way just like any other theory. Will we see something like this? Instead of is God dead, will we see is Darwinism dead? Will we see Eugene Koonen's byline there that the modern synthesis has crumbled, apparently beyond repair? I was going to do, this is what a lot of us are interested in, chimps to mankind, right? We just couldn't get that one in. And we're going to deal with what we've heard for a long time, that we share 99% of our genome with chimps, so we must have evolved from chimps. Did we evolve from a common ancestor with chimps? Are we descended from just two parents? I mean, creationists say we descended from just two parents. Is that true? Who are Lucy? You've heard many of the NOVA programs and Discovery programs and so forth. We see Lucy, we see the Neanderthal. You said you had a genetic thing and you were 5% Neanderthal, right?
Oh, my husband.
Oh, your husband's.
It's more understandable, but.
That's a low shot. Is that on tape?
Yep.
I'm gonna bribe her on that one. My husband's a Neanderthal. What does the scientific evidence show? And then in September, we're going to take up intelligent design. What is intelligent design? What isn't it? Very misunderstood, and sometimes purposely misunderstood. How does intelligent design apply to biology? Is intelligent design a better explanation than Darwinian evolution? We'll put that on the table and examine it. Isn't intelligent design religion, not science? We'll examine that. And then after that, we'll do part 5. I'm going to put special creation on the table, just like we put Darwin on the table, and ask the same things from a scientific standpoint. What is the scientific theory of special creation? Should a religious theory be appropriated into science? That's heresy in some schools, some ways of thinking. It wasn't for many hundreds of years, but it is today. What is the hard empirical evidence for creation? Does God actually give evidence empirically for himself? Must science be done under what's called methodological naturalism? You go and take any science course. All my science courses just were based on material. That's all there is. It was assumption. I mean, it's if anybody said, "What are you talking about?" What are you talking about? I mean, you have to start with no. That's not science. Science is you can make a proposition, but you have to find a methodology, and methodology is evidence and testing and repeatability and falsifiability and so forth. Anyway, so why does science have to be done just this one way?
Wow, what a spirited discussion and conversation we had afterwards, after that talk. I was surprised that many, no matter what level, even at the PhD level, had never heard of such gaping problems in Darwinism and the ad hoc attempts that are being made to plug the holes. We've been taught Darwinian evolution since knee-high. It's all there is, and that someday science will answer all these objections. But a few of the attendees were noticeably shaken. Even those with religious beliefs, many of them believed that the Bible was true, and they were delighted that creation was getting a fair hearing, but they even ended up getting into arguments among themselves about various interpretations of Genesis. Some believed that the word day in Genesis must be interpreted as a 24-hour time period, and they were distraught that current science indicates that life on Earth began billions of years ago. But other creationists who accepted the Genesis account, they interpreted the word day, which is the Hebrew word yom, to mean long periods of time. Still others believe that the creation accounts and the Darwinian account were both true at the same time, and they could be reconciled. So others are starting to believe that new science and scientific hypotheses are absolutely needed, intelligent design being one of them. It was a great discussion. Most thought this kind of exchange of ideas was just wonderfully stimulating and represented the best that science and intellectual engagement has to offer. I agree. I was just floating afterwards because of the discussion. But also, we all saw the political ramifications that these kind of truth-seeking sessions from different points of view, what that can initiate. I can't imagine that going unnoticed at corporate headquarters, especially as I want to take on the next topic of human evolution. What's the evidence regarding humans descending from the ape family? So be sure to join me for that one. That's part 3. That's next in my investigation. But until then, you keep thinking critically for yourself. Look at the evidence. Follow the evidence. Follow the path wherever it may lead. So next time, part 3, human evolution. See you right here. Next time, I'm Stuart Orr.